economic geographers. Welcome back. Just want to remind you, you have a quiz next Thursday. It's on your third documentary. That's in your syllabus if you can't remember what that is. And it's the same style as your last documentary quiz. You'll watch it. It'll be on Canvas. It'll be open next Thursday until midnight, and it's 10 questions. And you need to make sure you take it because it is a big part of your grade. And then the last thing we have to worry about is your final. I sent an email today about the final being multiple choice. That's the overwhelming response that I've gotten from you all. You've said that you prefer multiple choice final, so that's what we're going to do. So read that email. Okay, today we are talking about consumption and the marketplace. So we're going to talk a little bit about the marketplace in geography, and we're going to talk about consumerism. And I have a Bob Dylan quote for you. We always did feel the same. We just saw it from a different point of view. Think about it. Okay, so when we talk about geography and the economy, as you know, we've talked about many different subjects with geography and the economy, but looking at the market and looking at consumerism, both of those things are going to be highly affected by geography, highly affected by culture, highly affected by a lot of different types of spatial distribution. So that's what we want to go over today. So first, let's think about geographic structures when it comes to things like interplace competition. And if you don't remember what interplace competition is, think about how you have a market and you have maybe multiple different commodities that can fill some sort of a niche. And so there's interplace competition. One way that, let's take coffee, for example. So let's take Starbucks, for example. And Starbucks is this coffee company, if you don't know, started in Seattle, started with one little coffee shop and has now expanded all over the world. There's even a Starbucks on the Great Wall of China. I've been there. Starbucks wanted to differentiate itself from other coffee companies, right? And so one thing that they did was by bringing in what was really Italian coffee, but what they kind of marketed as like high-end coffee with all of the lattes and the cappuccinos and stuff like that. That's pretty common today, but when Starbucks started, nobody knew what the hell a cappuccino was or anything like that, at least not here in the US. So one way that you might deal with interplace competition is to differentiate your product. Try to create something that like there's coffee there and there's coffee here, but I know that this coffee is going to be something special, or I know that they're going to make it in some ridiculous way with like a half cap, half latte, low foam. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? The way that geography can come in is with a couple of different things. So we're going to talk about urbanization and then suburbanization. But your ability to expand to different markets. Obviously, that's the basic way that geography is going to come in. Can you take your commodity to a different market? Can you get into different markets around the state, around the country, and around the world? And there's going to be some issues to that when it comes to culture and when it comes to ability to navigate that much space. So we're going to get into that. Service sectors. So service sectors, definitely geography has come to play, and I know that you're probably familiar with this, but with outsourcing of manufacturing is something that we've talked about earlier in the semester, but outsourcing of the service sector. So if you remember that triangle that is different economic sectors, starting with the primary down here, the bottom of the triangle, that's agriculture and mining, if you remember, and then the secondary is manufacturing, the tertiary is services. And if you don't remember what that means, it's services to the economy, things like people who sell things, people who provide I don't know, massages, facials, all that kind of stuff. It's not something like a firefighter, even though a firefighter is providing a service, but remember that's a service to the people. The service sector is service to the economy. So when we look at specifically the outsourcing of the service sector, not manufacturing, we're familiar with manufacturing and with agriculture, that has happened in the last 3 decades especially. We really see that moving along, where we see our help centers or call centers move to places like India or other places in South Asia, other places in Southeast Asia. And what has enabled that to happen is an increase in technology and clear speaking, you know, the ability to, when I was little and we would call home to Australia, there was like a definite like lag in time when like your word went out into the world and then it came back. But what we've seen with the increase in technology in the last couple of decades is the ability to outsource things like services, because there's not that sort of lag when it comes to talking on the phone, when it comes to our access to Wi-Fi. So our service sector has been outsourced more and more, data processing, all of that to take advantage of low cost labor. Now that is bringing better lower middle class jobs into places like India, which is a hugely stratified society that has a lot of very, very poor people. 70% of Indians don't have access to a toilet, to give you an example. But what is it doing to our economy here? It's taking away our middle class jobs. So, and then of course, we've talked about this a whole lot, but just to remind you, agglomeration, that's the clustering of economic activity. That's when we have certain economic activities that work best when they're clustered together. Things like Silicon Valley, if you remember, things like Hollywood, where you have a final product that needs a lot of different types of information to go into that final product. A movie needs producers, writers, actors, costume designers, hair stylists, sound technicians, gaffers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're benefited when they're close together. So when we're looking at geographic structures in the economy, things like access to technology, things like the hyperspeed that technology and finance has been in the last couple of decades has made it seem like geography is almost not an issue when it comes to the economy. Like it used to be, you know, you were confined to a geography and you had to work within the consumer market, within the resources, within the capital that you had in that market. And in the last several decades, we've really seen our ability to expand our economy without those geographic boundaries being so much of an issue anymore, but they still are. We're going to talk about that. So all of this interplace competition, the outsourcing of service sectors, it all questions control and power relations within commodity chains. So when we think about what that means for Dell computers, for example, to have most of their data processing and their help centers on a completely different part of the world from where their main consumer market is, well, that brings in the question of control and how if your economy, let's take for example, outsourcing to India. If your economy becomes dependent on these consumer markets in different part of the world, how does that structure and change your economy? How does that change your culture, right? So think about how those things might be changed. Okay, if you remember a producer-driven chain, we've talked about that a little bit, but when we talk about producer-driven chains, we're talking about, I have a graph over here. So producer-driven chain. An example of a producer-driven chain would be Toyota or Volkswagen. Those are both companies that dictate the market from the producer side. So they exert, if you remember this term, upstream, that's the material input, over raw material, and they have something to do with the downstream, the production and the distribution. So, but they control it from the production side. So a producer-driven chain means that the producer of that product is really who's dictating the market, as opposed to, I'll come right back to this, as opposed to our buyer-driven. If you remember, our buyer-driven had to do with Walmart and IKEA, for example, are two examples. But it has to do with large retailers and brand name merchandisers who essentially open their shop and then they control like what they're taking from where. So instead of the producer producing the Volkswagen, for example, and dictating that market, you now have the retailer essentially dictating the production. So when we look at how that factors into this question back here, the question of control and power relations, well, think about in your head, you now have this idea of producer-driven chains. We've talked about that earlier in the semester, and we have this idea of how geography affects the economy in certain aspects of access to different consumer markets, how that's becoming less and less an issue because of things like technology, fast transportation, all of that. So how is that going to change different power structures if you have a company like Volkswagen, for example, who is a producer-driven chain? How is that going to dictate certain things like wages in markets around the world? We traditionally look at economics from what the market will bear, meaning what people are willing to pay and how much it costs to produce something. But now that we can kind of jump around the world and take low-cost labor here and low-cost resources here, how might the power structure change when a company like Volkswagen, for example, controls so much of a labor market and a resource market? Because Volkswagen is, I think it's still the biggest car company in the world. It was recently anyway. And back down here to Walmart and to IKEA. So I have a video on IKEA that is on your canvas if you want to take a break and watch it right now. So what you would have seen is the environmental impact of IKEA. So IKEA is, like we said, a buyer-driven chain, and Walmart is a buyer-driven chain. And Walmart could almost be classified as both a buyer and a producer-driven chain. It's not quite, because it's not producing anything. It's a retail market, but hear me out. So Walmart is a monster when it comes to retail. That's not a judgment on calling them a monster. Is not a judgment on them. But they're a monster when it comes to their share of the retail market. Let me give you some idea. Okay, so Walmart supplies 40% of the groceries bought in the US today. Let me say that again. So of all the people buying groceries today in the US, 40% of their grocery products are going to be bought at a Walmart. Does that make sense? So when I talk about them being a monster for retail, they are going to control a whole lot of the consumer market. And that can also dictate control in many different ways. So think about this. And we can think about this in good and bad ways. There's a couple of different things we could discuss with Walmart. One is the Walmart strategy. So the Walmart strategy, they use all kinds of stuff. They use just in time, which is they don't want to take up too much space with certain things, like toilet paper takes up a lot of space and it always has this even flow, except for right now, of course. So as soon as you buy toilet paper at a Walmart, it goes back to their supplier to get on the truck right now going to Walmart another case of toilet paper. Does that make sense? They utilize that very well. And remember, they're a huge, huge retailer. So if we're thinking about just in time and how that's going to drive things like how many trucks are going to be on the road, how much stuff is going to be moved if we're constantly resupplying Walmarts. But the other thing that they do is they create a grid. So Walmart works really, really well in, I'm getting a thing to draw on. Walmart works really well in rural places or in smaller towns. They have not broken into a city market yet. They don't do well in the city yet. So what they do is I think I was going to use this and clean it off before. So they take trying to make my face bigger. It's not working. Okay, well, you see this over here in the corner. So they take a town and they basically grid it out and they figure out, and this is going to come in later when we talk about the Kristaller method. They figure out, okay, where is the cheapest place? Vejamir, this is now not working. Where is the cheapest place for me to put my Walmart, where I can get the cheapest rent, but get the best access to enough of the population. So I'm going to grid out the town. I'm going to figure out where the populations are, where the people who are likely to shop at Walmart are, and I'm going to put my Walmart right here. And people are going to be super stoked because Walmart has all kinds of stuff and it's really, really cheap. And I'm going to have put this strategically so that it would be good if these pens worked. And I put this strategically so that I know, working yesterday, strategically so that I know that my downtown right here is going, that's where the prime real estate market is going to be for stores and stuff like that. So I know that I'm going to put my Walmart close enough to that prime real estate area that I'm going to draw in the people who might, they could go down here or they could just like hop on over to Walmart. I'm going to get people really excited by having a whole bunch of doorbuster deals when I first open and prizes, and I'm going to hire a lot of people. In fact, Walmart goes in and they overhire people when they go into a city. And everybody's super happy because they're getting underwear for like 5 cents a piece, and they're winning hoses and sheds and I don't know what else. And so pretty soon they're spending a lot more money here and less money is coming in here. So what happens is these guys start to go out of business. And that's when Walmart then figures out, where else can we put a Walmart? Now we can take advantage of pretty cheap real estate, and we're still going to get a good share of the market. And now more of downtown is going out of business. And now I put in another Walmart and another Walmart, and pretty soon I saturate the market with Walmarts, which I know seems ridiculous because you think, how can they stay open and how can they afford all of that different real estate space? And I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But what they've effectively done is gotten people super stoked on going to Walmart, put their downtown out of business. Now everybody is reliant on Walmart as the only real retail chain in the town. And all those people that they overhired, they fire. So they first overhire people, and then after they're established and they have a good share of the market in the town, they start to fire people, and then they start to understaff their Walmarts, and they put all of the local economy out of business anyway. So now people have to go there, even though they are not happy with Walmart anymore. They have not been able to do this in the urban market, and there's a lot of different reasons why, and you can probably figure out why that would be. How did I get over here? Sorry, probably confused you. So one of the things that they do is they take control of a local market. So I'm trying to explain Walmart as a buyer-driven chain, both from a geographically localized area and then a global area. So that's what they do, is they go into a town, they grid it out, they figure out where's the best retail space for us, that people are going to come here, but it's going to be far enough away from the downtown. Downtown businesses start to go out of business. We're talking about pretty small, pretty spread out towns. And then they put in another Walmart and then another Walmart, and downtown pretty much goes away altogether. And so now people are reliant on Walmart, which is how you get 40% of the groceries bought in the US in a place like Walmart. It's not like, oh, everybody wants to go there for their groceries. Pretty soon it's often the only place to shop. So, and then, like I said, they fire people, they start to understaff their gigantic warehouses, and they and then people are just dependent on, the small town is dependent on that. And so you might think saturating the market with like all this different retail space isn't very smart. except if you put every other business or most other businesses out of town. So Fresno, for example, has something like 7 Walmarts. Fresno. So Fresno is about a 200,000 person town. It's pretty spread out. It's not a centrally, doesn't have like a real central business district. It doesn't have like any real part of it that's highly urbanized. It started as a farming town, and it basically reflects that pattern of sprawl. So you get 7 Walmarts all around a pretty wide space. Those are the major retail places when it comes to anything that you would need for your house, a lot of clothes, baby things, grocery items, pharmacy items, all of that. So that's one way that they take control of a space. Okay. Another thing that they do is, again, because they are such a huge retailer, they have these huge warehouse spaces. What they'll do is they'll take companies like, let's say, Revlon, for example. And they'll take Revlon, which, if you don't know, is a cosmetic company. Now, Revlon makes, most cosmetic companies make lots of different products. They'll make your standard like mascara and concealer and stuff like that. But then they'll also tend to have like all these other things, like all these extra little things that aren't part of their real central market. And Walmart, because they have so much space, they'll allow enough space for a company like Revlon in their store to sell every single one of their products. So a place like CVS or Walgreens doesn't have that much space for Revlon. Revlon gets to get their couple of things in there, their mascara, their blush, whatever. But at Walmart, they're going to be able to sell their entire range. And pretty soon, because Walmart is such a big retailer, and because they're able to sell so many different types of products there, it becomes the lion's share of a company like Revlon's sales. So Revlon sells about 33 to 35% of their products at Walmart every year. So that's a good percentage. Master Lock, that's the lock, right? That maybe if you go to the gym or something, you have a little lock. 25% of their sales go through Walmart. Are you starting to get an idea of how Walmart can control so many different parts of production as well as the market? So that's why I said that Walmart is buyer driven, but is almost at a point where it's producer driven. And it's not, because it's not actually producing anything, but it's almost at a point where it's asserting control over production of things. Because if Revlon, for example, sells 35% of their sales, their yearly sales at Walmart every year, and Walmart says, hey, if you don't give this to us for cheaper, we're going to cancel your contract. There goes 35% of your annual sales. So how do I make it cheaper? Well, I'm going to have to do things that I didn't want to do, like test on animals. I don't think people test on animals anymore, but that's just an example. I might have to compromise my ethics. I might have to compromise my labor standards. I might have to move my factories from here in the US, where I pay people wages and healthcare and stuff like that, to a country like Vietnam, where I'm not going to have to pay those things, because otherwise I'm going to lose 35% of my retail market every year. So that's the kind of power that a company like Walmart can have. And if you watched that video on IKEA, you saw differing going along with the same buyer-driven chain model, but how they're creating a whole lot of environmental damage, and they're selling this product that's kind of like, you go into IKEA and it's all set up in their warehouses, and it's so cute and pretty, and you're like, oh, I want my house to be cute and pretty like this, and really it's a bunch of crap. But they're selling this image, and they're selling this image for pretty cheap, but they're creating all this environmental damage, as you saw in the video that you watched. So when we look at the geography of something like a buyer-driven chain, and the size that a company can get to now, like Walmart. So the reason that Walmart has been able to become this monster in retail is because they've been able to move not only all over the country, but all over the world. There are very few countries in the world today that don't have a Walmart. So Iceland doesn't have a Walmart. Iceland doesn't have a lot of chains in it, though. It doesn't have McDonald's either. That's for multiple different reasons. So there's a few companies in the world, I'm sorry, a few countries in the world that don't have Walmart, but Walmart is like Starbucks. It's gone to it's basically just covered the globe. So when we have the ability to move things around very cheaply, to market, to create marketing campaigns that can reach people all over the world, that's when you get a company that starts selling so much of a product like Revlon that they can control not they can control how that company is going to choose to produce its own product. Okay, so has geography been overcome by technological innovations in finance? So we were talking about technological innovations and how that has allowed people to hop over to places like India in order to take advantage of call centers, and of course manufacturing and stuff like that. But what about finance? Because finance is something that's interesting, that we could say is becoming less and less not just a issue of geography, but an issue of actual physicality, right? So in the past, finance is something that relied on the trading of actual money, whereas now it's becoming so removed, not just from geographic obstacles, but from like actual physical obstacles, where we can Iceland, once again, as an example, is one of the countries in the world that's going towards no paper money, no physical money, where everything is basically electronic and online. So there's other issues with that. But is it possible to say that because of the advances in technology, geography is no longer an issue when it comes to finance? So we can look at the hypermobility, if you remember that word, hypermobility, of how finance has basically superseded the issue of geography. First, money has become largely electronic, and think about all the different ways that we can trade money today. So just think about the ways that you might trade money, like with your roommate, for example. One great thing selling Girl Scout cookies this year was Venmo, because we were able to sell so many more cookies, because you see people, you're outside of Lazy Acres or whatever, and you're selling cookies, and people are like, oh, I don't have any money. And it's like, we take Venmo, and then suddenly they buy 5 boxes because of that invisible technological transfer of money. Smartphones have become this major asset in finance, with using financial transactions like things like PayPal or Venmo, or you can have your whole stock portfolio on your smartphone. You know, you can trade small money like cookies, or you can trade big money like your investments using your smartphone. And then, because we have these financial centers all over the world and financial markets all over the world, we can engage in financial trading 24 hours a day. There used to be a working day that was based on London time when it came to finance. So London was for a long time the leader. I know that it seems like New York should be, but for a long time, London was the leader when it came to when the markets opened, when the markets closed. But now we can have this 24-hour-a-day trading because of our financial markets that are centered in these major centers around the world. I'm going to give those centers in just a minute. And we increasingly interact with financial institutions by internet. We increasingly interact with everybody by, I mean, look at us now. We're totally online. But think about the last time you actually went to the bank. And when we go to the bank, how little is done there. Certain people are going to need to go to the bank a whole lot. People who work as bartenders, you know, waitresses, I don't know, exotic dancers. You're making a lot of tips, so you're probably not going to just keep bags of money around. So those people might go more and more into financial institutions, but I never go pick up my paycheck. It goes from my work to my bank, and then from there it goes to my credit card and my mortgage. So not only do I never see it, I never really have it either. All right. So when we look at global financing and how geography is no longer really an obstacle because of our accessibility to technology, and how that allows for a 24-hour financial day, and et cetera, all the things we just talked about. It's interesting because there's still these geographic centers of finance, those geographic centers being London, New York, Chicago. And we look at just those 3 cities, they accounted for 50% of the share of, and that's 2010. I know that's 10 years ago, but they're just examples. Other examples of financial um, city centers that are major in financial trade: Hong Kong, Tokyo, Shanghai. Those are all cities where, again, they're becoming more and more important when we're talking about financial transactions. And so it's interesting that while geography has become less important when we're talking about finance, and that we can do so many things online, that there's still these financial trade centers. And think about why that is. Why do you think that is? Why do we still need the physical geography, the literal place for these financial centers? Well, it would have something to do with what we talked about with agglomeration economies, that while we can kind of have this whole virtual world of finance, we still need that trade center where we have people who are financial wizards, you could say, and not even financial wizards, people who work in trading, and you can work in trading, you can be on your computer and completely work, in the stock market, but we still have those financial centers of trade. And it has something to do with an agglomeration of people who would be particularly well versed in that kind of work. It has something to do with access to the larger markets, Goldman Sachs, for example, and access to other large financial trading banks. So how do we explain this paradox of accessibility to finance becoming more global, but it's still isolated to financial centers? Well, how do you explain it? I explained it by what I just said, which is needing to have a center where people who are highly specialists when it comes to finance are going to agglomerate together. But you tell me what you think. And then I have this word down here again. If you remember, I mentioned this word in class, neo-medievalism. So medievalism was back in the day, right? If we were in Europe, and it wasn't just in Europe, but Europe is the place where the term medieval comes from, where you have an economy that's based on agriculture. So land ownership is the thing. If you own a lot of land, you're going to be wealthy. And if you're wealthy, then you're going to be in control of the political system. And you're also going to be in control of the military, because if you're wealthy and you're in control of the political system, you want more resources. So you have the military to help you get more resources, right? Take over more land. And we had these centers, if we take Europe as an example, although it's not the only example, we had these centers of financial prominence and political prominence in Europe during medieval times. The big cities still that we see in Europe, places like London, Paris, they were these centers of trade. They were centers where you had more access to education and stuff like that, but they were kind of like if we looked at a map of Europe, they were these pinpoints of power when it came to both finance and to political power. And so I've argued in class that what happens after that, what happens when we create the Industrial Revolution, and when we move away from wealth being tied to just land. Now wealth can be tied to production, and you have these millionaires and billionaires for the first time in world history, where people like the Rockefellers come along. I mean, Rockefeller comes along, and then the whole Rockefeller family comes along, where they had wealth that was like never ever heard of in the history of the world, because wealth used to be tied to land, and you can only own so much land. So your wealth is always going to have this ceiling. But when the Industrial Revolution comes along, you have this like incredible, just it's limitless how much money you can make. So we see this switch with the Industrial Revolution when it comes to the economy, but we also see a switch when it comes to political systems, where the old system of controlling political systems through a monarchy, monarchs are basically people who owned and controlled the most amount of land, so they controlled the political system. That no longer is a sensible type of political system in a new economy. So that political system worked with agriculture, but once we move into industry, that political system doesn't work anymore. And so we move into these participatory democracies, for one. There's other types of governments as well, but let's take the participatory democracy as an example. But now that we are becoming placeless almost in our finance, in our capital, in our production, in our service sectors, now that we're not so much reliant on the state, the one country. Remember, state in political geography refers to a country, not to the state of California, but the state of the US, right? So if we looked at the participatory democracies and the economy the way that it had been designed, let's say 100 years ago, well, the state had a lot of power, the political system had a lot of power. But like we talked about in class, where does the political system stand today? With an economy that is increasingly less constrained by geography, what sort of political system is going to make sense with this new economy? And I could argue that it's something that looks a lot like medievalism, where we're going to have these city states like Singapore, Tokyo, right? New York might be one of them, that become these monster centers of finance, and that becomes the new sort of order to the world. Tell me what you think about that. So while we might see monsters of retail like Walmart go all over the world, you run into problems with culture. So let's say that we're McDonald's, and McDonald's had a very innovative way of going about producing food for pretty cheap. One of the ways that they did that was they limited their menu, so that way they were just constantly making hamburgers and french fries, so that your food was ready as soon as you got there, because that's all they were making, right? But what happens when you want to get into a market like India? India is 1 billion people, 1,200,000,000 people. You want to get into that market if you're McDonald's, but if your main thing is beef, what's the issue going to be? The issue is going to be that Indians, the majority of Indians don't eat beef. That Hindus believe that, first of all, you're not supposed to take anything from anybody, so you don't want to take a life from animals. So most Hindus are vegetarian, but they're especially not beef eaters. There's this idea that the universe all comes from a cow. So what happens when you want to go into a market that thinks of the cow as holy, and so is not going to eat the cow? Well, you have to globalize, this word right here, globalize. And this is something that a lot of transnational companies do, globalization. Globalization is where you go into a different culture and you take something that's local or something that makes sense locally in order to get into that market. So remember that McDonald's was able to be successful in part because it really limited what it offered. So that way it limited, production time. It limited, basically you had to do the same thing over and over and over again. You could always have the same menu ready. It made it very, very quick. That's what brought people into McDonald's, one of the things, and it was cheap. So they go into different places, and this is just some of the examples of things that they offer in different McDonald's around the world. So the Vegemite English muffin, that's going to be in Australia. If you've never tried Vegemite, don't. It is gross. It's this like black yeast spread that you put on bread and stuff like that. Some Australians love it, some can't stand it. My mom loves it. My dad and I just make the smell. Anyway, it's the ebi filet. So the chicken singa porridge, the shaka shaka chicken, the McVeggie, the lamb shawarma, the et cetera, et cetera. You can kind of try to figure out where each one of these would be, but it's getting into the market around the world, from getting into the Chinese market, which is 1,300,000,000 people, getting into the Indian market, getting into the Australian market. Why in the hell there's only 20 million people there? And on and on and on. This is globalization. It's how transnational corporations diversify their activities depending on the cultural market that they're going into. So where do we shop? Remember earlier when I was talking about Walmart with this very handy graph I made, we have the Christaller method. So Christaller was a geographer, and he came up with this whole idea of how to go about figuring out the consumer market. So, and how to figure out geography in that consumer market. We're going to talk about the good and the bad of his methods, or of his theory. So his whole idea was in order to have a marketplace, it has to offer good and services, duh. And he had this idea. First of all, he tried to figure out, he used squares. I'll use this. I'll go right back to that. First, when he tried to figure out his isotropic plane, he had circles together, he had squares together. Both of them left this open space when they were when he was trying to figure out access to the market and how far people will travel and stuff like that. So he came up with this hexagonal pattern, which allowed him to put his isotropic plane on a flat space. Um, and he was trying to figure out basically two things. So one was the range, how far people are willing to travel. And now that's going to vary, right? So first thing in figuring out the geography of a marketplace is how far are people willing to travel. Now, how far people are willing to travel in part depends on the service, in part depends on the person. And there's a lot of different things that go into this, some of which he ignored, some of which he didn't. So I'll talk first about what he didn't ignore. So let's say that you need to buy, um, groceries, or you need to go to the doctor. Both of those things are going to be, you need to go to the doctor because you have an actual issue, not because of a checkup or something like that. So let's say that I need to go to the doctor and I need to get groceries. I'm willing to travel farther for that, right? Because those are necessities. I need to have food in my house, and I have a cough. That I've had for like 2 months now or something like that, maybe not that long. So I want to go to the doctor, and I'm probably willing to travel a lot farther for that. So that's one part of it, as opposed to maybe I want to buy clothes, makeup, something else that's not a necessity. I'm not willing to travel nearly as far for that. So central place theory, for one, takes into account our range, what we're willing to travel for, how far we're willing to travel. So where you want to so if you want to be successful, if you're Lush, for example, Lush is a cosmetic company that makes like bath bombs and lotions and et cetera, et cetera. And they do it all really with like a high ethical standard, a high environmental standard. But so while they have a niche in that there's certain people who are going to want to buy into a company that is ethical when it comes to the environment, when it comes to labor, they have that niche. They're still selling something that's fringe, and they're selling something that a lot of different companies offer. So moisturizer, for example, is something that you can get from a lot of different companies, and there's a lot of different companies that do it ethically, that do it with good labor practices, et cetera, et cetera. So the Kristaller method was all about, where am I going to have to place how centrally am I going to have to be located? Because people are not going to travel nearly as far for me at Lush as they would for a doctor, right? I have interplace competition. I'm a niche market. I'm something that people don't need every day. Maybe they get as like an extra little thing. Maybe they get it for a holiday, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to have to be closer to the central business district, which means I'm going to have to pay more for retail space, as opposed to a doctor who can set themselves away from the central business district. They can save on rents because you are more willing to travel to that doctor than you are to Lush. Does that make sense? So that's what we're talking about with the range. So the range of the good. And then the other is the threshold. That's the minimum number of people that you're going to need for that retail operation to be viable. That means people going in, right? And people supporting, but people going in. So if I'm Lush and I know that the range is not going to be great, that people are willing to travel for me, but they're not willing to travel that far for me, then I need to get more people into my store in order for it to be successful, for one. And because I'm paying more, so I have a higher premium when it comes to overhead costs, renting a space and stuff like that. And so I need more people to come in. And I need more people to come in also because I'm a niche market. And if things get bad, if the coronavirus happens, then nobody's coming to me, but everybody's still going to the doctor, right? So the threshold has to do with the minimum level of business, people to come into your retail operation in order for it to be actually successful. So in figuring this out, he was basically trying to figure out a model for how different businesses, how different retailers, how different places that have to rent a space, because a doctor isn't a retailer, but they still have to rent a space and stuff like that. How can we figure out where to be geographically in order to get as much of the market as possible and to save on rent? That's the Chris Dollar method, or theory, sorry. So his whole idea was, once again, figuring out, using these hexagons, if this is a central business district, where do the people live? How far are they willing to travel? How close do different companies have to be to each other, depending on what the threshold is, depending on what the range is of that company? Does that make sense? That's how we get places like malls, where you have like a whole collection of specialized merchandise, because that's going to increase the likelihood of your threshold to increase as well. Maybe you're not willing to travel for me, Lush, but you're willing to travel because you have to get your kid new shoes. And now you're in a mall and you're in a concentrated retail space, and Lush is right next door. So you're going to pop in and get yourself something, especially since you just bought your kid some freaking shoes. So this whole plane takes into account things like that. It was a way of figuring out the geography of threshold and range in order to be successful as a retailer. But there's problems with this design. So one is that he set his whole hexagonal isotropic plane in a flat space. And I have this question, is the world flat? And you're probably thinking, what am I asking? I'm not actually asking if the world is flat. I'm saying it's interesting that a geographer didn't take into account that there's geographic barriers. There's geographic barriers to a town. So let's say we have a town that looks like this, and we have the population living out here. And this is our central business district. And so we know that Lush wants to be here in this prime business district, but the doctor can be out here a little bit because people are willing to travel for that. But we're not paying attention to, so let's say I'm a person coming from out here where I live, and then I make my way in here, and great, everything's centrally located, blah, blah, blah. But we're not paying attention to geography. We're not paying attention to how the world is not flat. How, if, and this is just an example, if there's like a big old wetland in between where some people live and where the central business district is, that even though you're pretty close by like how a crow flies, you're not actually close, because it doesn't take into account things like a mountain might be in your way or a lake might be in your way. Does that make sense? He didn't think about geographic barriers, and he also didn't think about income barriers. He didn't think about issues. He kind of assumed that every person in his threshold and in his range was the same middle class person, same financial background. So while his theory makes some sense, it ignores some pretty major things that geographers pay attention to usually. Now I want to ask, is this still necessary in our new world of online shopping, and our new world of, finance being something that is completely, you can shop for something, you can pay for it, you can transfer money without ever leaving your house. Is something like this still viable or important? So you tell me what you think. Now, he was coming up with his theory in the 1930s. And then if you remember when I talked about ethnicity and geography, I talked about the movement from urban spaces into suburbs. And if you remember when that happened, post-World War II, it was really fueled by the GI Bill, et cetera, et cetera. So we had this movement of a lot of, especially middle-class spenders, buyers, into suburban areas. They were decentralized from urban centers. Plus, people had more cars. They had more expendable income because of the post-war boom that we talked about already. More people were going to college. Oh, there's Gingy. Hi, Gingy. More people were going to college. There was more middle-class women, and more middle-class women in the workforce, as remember we talked about gender inequality. So suburbanization has had this lasting impact. But there are some things that have been affecting that movement, that decentralization of the urban area, and the Chris Dollar theory and the central business district. So one is gentrification. One is that a lot of people are leaving suburbs and moving back into cities. And the way that they're doing that is So people left cities because cities tend to be very stratified economically, where cities tend to be the wealthiest people, the people who can afford to live like in a penthouse away from all the grit of the city, and the poorest people. So we're looking at a range of people who are like, I don't know, oh man, the only examples I can think of are Trump and Precious, if you can, if you remember that movie, if anybody saw Precious. So like the very, very poorest down and out people and like the very wealthiest people. And there wasn't a big middle class. The middle class left and went to the suburbs because they couldn't afford to live in the city well. So it's either poverty in the city or extreme wealth. And if you want to live somewhere in between, people left. But in the 1960s in London, a few people started saying, hey, why don't we go into rundown areas? We'll buy something, it'll be so much cheaper, and then we'll fix it up. That's the beginning of gentrification. If you watched Mad Men, maybe, I told you guys I was rewatching Mad Men. Later in the series, Peggy buys this brownstone in what was like a terrible neighborhood that now the thing would be worth like $20 million or something like that. So you see people who don't want to leave the city, and they start what's called gentrification. Gentrification is, all right, I'm going to move in. I'm going to move into this rundown neighborhood. I'm going to fix it up. And then my friends are going to move in next door. And now we're going to have new businesses are going to come in because they're going to want to capture our middle class market. So now you have fancy coffee shops and grocery stores, Whole Foods comes in, Starbucks comes in, and then banks start to lend in that area. If you remember when I talked about ethnic economies, we had a lot of banks that didn't lend to businesses in redlined areas. So now they start to lend in those areas again, and suddenly, boom, the economy of that neighborhood has changed. Now there's the whole thing with gentrification. People are like, oh, that's great. Now the city is fixed up. Well, what happens to the people who had lived in that neighborhood who couldn't afford to live anywhere else? They just get pushed out further and further and further into the margins of the city. So suburbanization has been a thing for a long time, but we're seeing people want to live in central locations again. And if you look at cities like Portland or like Seattle, those cities are trying to create a new urbanized center. So a center, people left the city not just because of, like I said, the stratification of the economy, but also, if you remember, I talked about how dirty cities were. Before the EPA, you had industrial waste. You didn't have anything that was controlling things like waste going into rivers and going into the air. But now we have these regulations that are supposed to curb environmental damage. So, and you have cities like Portland, for example, that have invested heavily, not just in public transportation, but in green public transportation, in bike paths and stuff like that, where you have people who find that the quality of life is much more enjoyable in a city like Portland. And that is leading to a re-centralization. So while for a long time, that whole central business district was suffering from, like I said, Walmart, like I said, suburbanization, et cetera, now you have people actually moving back to cities. And so we have to ask, are we going to see a resurgence of the brick and mortar kind of retail center, or are we going to continue to go online? You have to tell me what you think. By the way, I set up these questions where I say you'll have to tell me what you think. Nobody tells me anything, which either tells me y'all aren't watching these lectures, or you just don't want to answer me. Okay, so let's look at Chicago, the development of Chicago's suburban shopping centers. Chicago was one of the cities in the country that like really went into suburbanization, like they went hard into suburbanization. And you can look at, Chicago is such a great example of so many different things when it comes to urban geography. You can look at things like how their suburbs aren't just developed in the post-World War II era, but they're also highly ethnically concentrated. So there's like entire suburbs that are just Jewish, like Highland Park, Illinois, which is right outside of Chicago, is like all Jewish. And then you could go next door to another suburb and it's all Polish. And then you go to another, see, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And think about what that would be if you were a retailer. That now you have this decentralized urban area, but it's not only decentralized, it seems to be kind of organized by ethnicity. So, what do I do if I'm a retailer? How do I branch into a market? If I'm coffee, for example, how am I going to make that accessible to a Jewish market, to a Polish market, to an African American market, et cetera, et cetera? How is that going to change? Again, this crystaller theory, how is that going to affect it? You guys tell me. And so when we look at the location of retail space, we've got the street being like a central business district, a downtown, a state street. The mall, which is interesting because the street is public space and the mall is private space. And I want you to think about what the difference is between that. So public space being the public controls it, and of course in malls there's still laws. It's not like it's a lawless place, but just follow me before you think to disagree with me. So if you look at State Street is a public space. All the retail spots on it, of course, they're private. They're in like their own privately owned uh, buildings, and you rent or you lease or something like that. But the space in front of it is public. Yeah. But a mall is all private, like it's one big privately owned area, and you rent space in that privately owned area. And the difference that we started to really see in the 1970s and the 1980s as retail space moved into the mall, a privately owned space, as opposed to the street, a publicly owned space, was curbing on things like who was allowed into that mall. You have mall security, right? A mall cop. And that mall cop is there to keep things civil and stuff like that, but also to ensure that whatever image that mall is trying to procure is going to stay in line. So if you're dirty or smelly, or if you want to protest the Gap, or if you want to do something that I don't think goes along with the image of the mall that I'm trying to create, because you're in that private space, I get to remove you. You don't have the same freedom of speech that you would have on the public space. So as we move our retail centers away from a publicly governed space, think about what else we remove. We also remove a central location where people can protest, people can celebrate, people can, et cetera, et cetera. And then of course we're moving online. What do you all think of online shopping? I mean, right now, that's pretty much all we're doing, right? Unless you go into CVS or Albertsons, which really looks like an Iraqi bunker right now. It's just, I feel like I'm like I'm not supposed to be there, like I feel bad for being in a grocery store right now. I'm running around and all the lights are bright and everybody's glaring at you. Anyway, it feels like a war zone. And then we have informal retail spaces. What does that mean? And how have we seen a growth in informal retail spaces as a result of online shopping? Things like Etsy, things like eBay, those are all informal retail spaces. There's other informal retail spaces, but think about how online shopping has allowed for a lot of movement away from the corporation because of informal retail spaces like Etsy or like eBay, where you can be just like a person living in rural Minnesota, and you make like quilts or something, dog beds or something like that. Something that you wouldn't necessarily be able to move into a brick and mortar store with. You wouldn't have the overhead for, you wouldn't be able to have a successful business necessarily that just sold dog beds. But now you have this outlet because of niche markets, and because your range is so much further, you don't have to worry about just appealing to the people of St. Cloud, Minnesota, or wherever you live, a small town, where only 3 people are going to buy dog beds. Now you can capture the market of every person looking for a quirky dog bed all over the country because of informal spaces that are now online. You know what I'm saying? That can lead to other things like a whole growth in green clothing. So I have a TED Talk for y'all to watch on Canvas. It's about 3 different innovative ways to make fashion more environmentally friendly. So go watch that. Okay. So you watch that. What do you think of it? So think about how in the last, just even since I started teaching 12 years ago, when I would lecture about things like fast fashion or the environmental degradation of the clothing that we buy or the food that we buy and stuff like that. Just since then, the amount of small niche retail markets of companies that sell things like shoes made out of recycled bottles or clothes made out of upcycled material. So, for example, upcycled material is you have or dead stock material is what I was meant to say. Upcycle is different, but let's say you're a big clothing house like J Crew. J Crew makes literally tons of clothes every year. Well, for whatever million dresses that they cut in one fabric, they have all this leftover fabric. That fabric used to end up in landfills, literally in landfills. But now you have these niche, innovative companies that, because of the internet, because they don't have to have a brick and mortar store, they can take that dead stock and turn it into a small clothing company. And so now they're diverting things that would have gone into the landfill, and they're able to capture enough of a market that they become successful businesses because of online and informal retail spaces. And then upcycling is when you take something and instead of recycling it, right, you repurpose it, you upcycle it instead of like breaking it down into its basic materials and then reusing it. You take the structure that it already is and like add it to or turn it into something else. Okay, how does advertising change, and how has advertising changed? Again, with informal retail spaces and with online marketing. Do you have certain companies that target you on your social media? I do, for sure. They're all the environmentally friendly, blah, blah, blah kinds of companies are always just like all the labor friendly companies are always like on there with their ads. So how has online social media targeted advertising also changed informal retail spaces and the mall and the street? um, and then the store itself, I keep saying the brick and mortar store. Some people say that pretty soon we're going to get away from brick and mortar stores. I don't think that's true. I mean, there's always going to be somebody who needs something today, right? And why do we have mostly naked men? I don't remember why I wrote that. But I had different interior and exterior layouts that create a certain atmosphere. So like roasting chickens in a window, you see that and you're like, if you eat chicken. Cozy chairs, or like something, a retail space that looks very bohemian, or a retail space that looks very modern, or the way that we put produce in different markets. There's all these different studies that show that if you have like one stalk of some like kale or something like that, nobody will buy it. But if you have like overflowing, like an entire area just full of kale, then people come and take it. So when we look at our brick and mortar stores, do they have a future? And how are they going to have to change? What are they going to have to do? What kind of niche markets or what kind of macro markets are they going to have to appeal to in order to keep in business? So when we look at our consumption processes, the purchase, the sale of commodities, and what we do with our commodities after we buy them. So we have this whole economy based on consumption, and we can see how much it's based on consumption right now. I'm sure you already knew how much it was based on consumption, but just think about how right now, because so many different retailers have had to shut down, how people aren't spending nearly as much money, how our clothing has become more about like comfort clothing, how certain companies are probably doing very, very well right now. Medical supply store companies, of course, toilet paper manufacturing, of course. But think about like the cozy clothing market and how that's probably seeing a huge jump right now. Think about gaming and not just online gaming, but at-home games that are probably in higher circulation right now. So we are definitely a economy that's based on consumerism and consumption. You can see how much we're going to be hurt because people aren't able to consume as much right now. We can see how much it's going to hurt our economy for sure. But we tend to focus marketing everything on the thrill of shopping, on the thrill of purchasing something, getting something, making ourselves feel good by rewarding ourselves with something. Using, discarding. How long are we going to use it? How well does it fit? Did I buy that because it was cheap, or did I buy it because I actually really liked it and I'm going to wear it a whole lot? How much of our clothing, of anything, is recyclable? Now, you would have seen that on the TED Talk that you watched, right? And how much can actually be repurposed? What types of materials do we have to have in order for them to be repurposed? We're going to have to get away from polyester, which is based in oil, in order to really repurpose our clothing. The wearing and the washing of clothing, how much does that take up when it comes to resources? And then I want to talk about leisure and tourism when it comes to consumption. So when we look at the everyday nature of consumption, not every large city is going to have a major manufacturing plant, but we're all going to have supermarkets. We're all going to have places to watch movies, stuff like that. This goes into the Kristaller method theory as well, that different sizes of towns, if you have a city, it's kind of like Walmart, right? Walmart can display all of Revlon's products. A city can have all the different types of products, as opposed to a smaller market in a town or a little village. Okay, so I've talked a lot about consumption. I want to move on to so consumers as dupes. That's what I was just sort of talking about with why we consume things. That we live in a consumption-based economy. I've already talked about a whole lot of this. I'll give you a second to look at it. Our production and consumption, are they mutually dependent of each other? Are we sovereign as consumers? Are we on our own as consumers? Are we influenced by the market? Are we influenced by marketing? That's what all of this is about. And then the sociocultural. So the sociocultural consumer construct has to do with a lot of what you could call conspicuousness. So conspicuous consumerism is one thing that really captures a lot of our market when it comes to our sociocultural ideas of why we consume things and the thought process we put into consuming things. So conspicuous consumerism is buying things or getting things based on an idea that you want to express to people. So if I want to show people that I'm conservative, right? Conservative in my if I want to show people that I'm conservative in, I don't know, sexuality and something like that, then consuming things that are like very high necked, covering like all of your body, stuff like that, you're sending out a message that you're not necessarily like displaying yourself. Other ways that we can consume things conspicuously is I can show you how environmentally friendly I am. I'll just drive a Prius, and I will always have a reusable mug with me and a bag that says I used to be a plastic bag, and I'll take that to the store. And I'll do all kinds of things so that I signal to you that I'm environmentally friendly. Now, whether those things are actually environmentally friendly or not, for example, having a Prius, yes, it uses less gas, but the battery is in order to produce the battery, it takes a whole lot of resources. So you actually have to keep your Prius and drive your Prius for, I think I forgot the number of miles, but it's something like 60,000, 70,000 miles before the Prius actually starts to balance itself out in the amount of resources that went into building that battery. And what if I'm driving a Prius, but I could just as easily walk or ride my bike? What if I could get a Vespa, right? If I'm just one person, if I'm just a single person, why am I driving a car anyway? I could be driving a motor scooter. So when we think about conspicuous consumerism, it's different ways to signal to people something about me, how cool I am, how environmentally friendly I am, how bohemian I am, how smart I am, how et cetera, right? That's why I wear these glasses. So you all think that I'm smart. It's like the intellectual equivalent of stuffing your bra. So that's not why I wear these glasses. I need them to see. More and more lately, by the way, I was trying to read this bottle of pills for my mom. I couldn't read it all without my glasses. and you needed to know that. So our sociocultural perspective talks about things like that. Like what sort of signals are being sent to you with how you should consume things, what kind of things you can consume. It goes to things like wealth as well. If I want to show you how wealthy I am, if I want to show you how successful I am, I could wear a Rolex or have a fancy car, et cetera, et cetera. You get it. So when we look at our consumption, it's changing geographically as well. I've been talking mostly about the American market and the US market and what's been happening here, but think about how things are changing around the world. So in the 1970s and 1980s, the middle class and the consumer market was dominated by Europe, Western Europe especially, because 70s and 80s, still the Cold War. North America, Japan was a huge market. South Korea started to grow really started to re- South Korea had a hard kind of post-Korean War 1950s 1960s, but by the 1970s they started to grow. Brazil is growing and emerging as a market. Mexico has gone up and down. It was a pretty good market going into the 1970s, and then it took a real dive in the 1980s, but we're starting to see some growth. Mexico has issues though, we're going to talk about next week. Argentina is an emerging market. So when we look at our emerging markets, um, while European, North American, Japanese consumers tended to drive the market in, like when I was growing up, now we're seeing these new emerging markets driving the market. And so how is consumption going to change when trying to reach those markets? How are we going to see if we have a huge globalized company that is producing, one set of goods but wants to reach as much of the world as possible? How are we going to see products change with these new emerging markets? And the best example of that is China. China, when I was born, China was a very poor country in the late 1970s. It was a very poor country. It had been through, we've talked about China, if you remember. So China since then has grown into the second biggest economy in the world, GDP wise, and the biggest economy in the world, PPP wise, purchasing power parity, or just purchasing power, you could say. They're the biggest economy in the world when it comes to purchasing power. So when we see this massive expansion of the middle class and of the buying power in places like China, how does that change the market? How does that change what's being marketed? And one is you have to take into consideration the economies of those places, the cultures of those places, like with India, when we were talking about not wanting to eat beef. But what about China? How is China changing the market? So we're seeing this steady movement to south trade. What south to south trade is this shift towards the Asian market, both being not all of the Asian market, but in Asia being both like the producing market as well as the consuming market. And we see that Asian markets in the 1970s, when Europe and North America was consuming everything, they were seen as like the place to have labor. Now they're the place to have labor and the place to have consumers. So how is that going to change our market? How is that going to impact the environment, et cetera, et cetera? Now, you don't have quite the same middle class yet in places like India and China, but they are definitely growing. And those are the two biggest populations in the world. So I think I've said this in this class before, but what China does is what the world is going to do. What China decides to do with the environment is going to affect the rest of the world. What China decides to do with their political systems, with their demands on labor, all of that, it's going to be what is set as the standard for the rest of the world. So we've talked a good amount about China. You watched that American Factory movie, which kind of gave you some ideas of the cultural differences in labor. But then the consumption market, we could talk about real estate, for example, and how China has changed the real estate market around the world. People who have earned a lot of money in China in the last couple of decades have started buying up real estate in different parts of the world. For example, Vancouver. Vancouver is a very pretty city in Canada, and right now the retail market is just out of control because so many different Chinese investors have come in and bought spaces, real estate in Vancouver, leading to this huge bubble in their real estate economy. Same thing is happening in Sydney. Same thing is happening in London, where you have these Chinese consumers and this new emerging middle class, and we can see how markets like the real estate market might change. Well, what about conspicuous consumerism? So one thing that you might see as a trend with Chinese consumers is that expensive consumer goods, or things that look expensive, or things that say expensive, become a part of success in their wider society. And that was true here in the US. It's still true here in the US, of course. I'm not saying that China is an exception when it comes to this. I'm just giving China as an example, since it's this huge emerging market. So if you think about kind of like the people who just a few decades ago were one of the poorest countries in the world, or maybe not one of the poorest, but a very poor country, to being the wealthiest country in the world, and how you want to show that success, and how that success might be things like buying big brands. But one thing with China's production laws is they don't always respect patents. So you have not only this emerging market of people who are attempting to show their success by buying high-end brands, but you also have a huge production market in China for counterfeit goods, makeup, for example, and things like phones. So here we have a fake iPhone. Things like bags, like Louis Vuitton bags, but not real Louis Vuitton bags. Hermes, any kind of high-end brand that says extreme wealth and success, you have not only a market for people who want to consume it in China, but also a market for counterfeit products, like going directly in and circling around. Okay, so I'm going to leave us today with this little smart car, and how our demands on the market are nothing to ignore. That if you imagine the kind of market that you want to be part of, you as young people who are getting ready to take over the world, and maybe you want something that looks an urban center that is accessible to more than just one class of people, socioeconomic class of people. Maybe we want a green economy. Right now is the perfect time for us to be investing in a green economy. Our economy is crashing around us, and the best way to get people working is to invest in infrastructure. That's what happened during the Great Depression. That's how we got all our big bridges and our big roads and our big dams built. So when you think about the future, this might not be your future, but think about what you want it to look like and how you're going to make that happen. And watch the videos that I posted, the IKEA video, the fast fashion video, if you haven't already watched it. And then I watched another one about consumerism. I posted another one about consumerism. And REI, it's about REI and consumerism. Watch those. And next week, I will have a lecture for you on Mexico and the ups and the downs that Mexico has seen in the last 100 years. And it's going to be so much fun and also really depressing. So look forward to that. You have a quiz next Thursday. Don't forget about that. Oh, shoot. Well, that's not the last thing I wanted to leave you with. The last thing I wanted to leave you with, besides ethical consumerism, was also tourism. So this ethical consumerism, what I've been talking about, how that's a whole niche market, that there's people who, like I said, with the recycled bottle shoes and clothes and the upcycled materials and the dead stock materials and all of that stuff. So that's kind of what I was just alluding to. I was talking about earlier, but also alluding to with like what kind of a market we want to have. So consumption has moral and ethical dimensions, and that if we demand those, that we're a part of the market too. So that, but I also had wanted to leave us with the idea of tourism as consumption. So let's think about tourism as consumption, and how we have an entire tourist economy around the world that's based on consuming cultures. Think about what that means. Think about what it means to actually be a tourist, to go in and observe somebody else's culture and to take back pictures of that culture. And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing at all. I just want you to think about it. I want you to think about tourism of people's cultures and how that is a form of consumption. Now we're literally conforming people's cultures around the world. Consuming people's cultures around the world. So think about that. Let me know what you think about it. I wish we had had this lecture in person. I would have heard things from Ling Ling, because Ling Ling was worked in real estate in Las Vegas. She would have added into us talking about the Chinese market in Las Vegas. When I talk about certain things, I can hear your voices in the back of my head, things that Noah would say, things that Nick would say, of course, things that Piper would say, and I just miss it all. So please send me some messages of what you might think of what we went through. Troy laughing, for example. All right, see you all next week. I think I would know how to turn this off faster now. No.